be a conversation, and the way we have planned this is to have a first batch of questions from my side, then we'll take some questions from the floor. I would say it's always difficult to meet whom you read, especially if you admire the reading and the author. It is always a risk to meet the author, and specifically, most specifically, to introduce the author. Yeah, or not. Yeah.
It's okay. Okay.
Yeah, no, it is.
Is it working now? Ah, yes. I was just about to explain what a big risk is to also from my side too, as I can imagine, to meet the author.
Well, so here we go. It's going to be a risk. It's, let's say, an introduction is always, in this case, doomed to failure because you've all read Hanif's work. So I'll just briefly go over some small details in the biography, and then we'll move on to conversation. So Hanif Kureishi was born in Bromley, London, to a Pakistani father from Madras, who came to the UK in 1950, and an English mother. The literary vein runs in his family, as his father also wanted to become a writer. He read philosophy at King's College London, and from the 1970s onward has devoted his life to writing. We've all seen the films based on his screenplays, and most notably, perhaps, My Beautiful Laundrette from 1985, directed by Stephen Frears. The script won the New York Film Critics Best Screenplay Award and was nominated for an Oscar for Best Screenplay. Several of his books, as you know, were adapted for film and television. The novel The Buddha of Suburbia from 1990 won the Whitbread Prize for Best First Novel, and was produced as a 4-part drama for the BBC in 1993. The short story, My Son the Fanatic, was adapted as a film as well in 1998. And other than this, he has several screenplays which were turned into films directed by Roger Mitchell, I will just name 3, The Mother from 2003, Venus 2006, and most recently The Weekend 2013 with Jean Broadbent and Lindsay Duncan. His second novel was The Black Album, 1995, The Next Intimacy, 1998, which was again adapted as a film in 2001, winning the Golden Bear Award at the Berlin Film Festival. But his unique form of writing is for some best encapsulated in his short stories. Amongst them, Love in a Blue Time, which appeared in 1997, followed by Midnight All Day in 1999, and The Body, my personal favorite, from 2002. Hanif Kureishi has also written non-fiction, including essay collections, the essay collection Streaming and Scheming, Reflections on Writing and Politics from 2002, and The Word and the Bomb from 2005. The memoir, My Ear and His Heart, Reading My Father, appeared in 2004. His most recent work is the novel The Nothing, which appeared early this year. Let me start with a provocation. Reading My Father, your work seems to do extensively with the relation with your father. Not so much with your mother. How were they both inspirational or not for what you've become as a writer?
Well, there's no doubt, as you imply, that my parents were equally important to me. But in terms of my writing, my father was of particular importance because when I was growing up in the suburbs during the 1960s, my sister and I noticed that we were considered to be rather strange in our neighborhood, that we were from we had an Indian background, that we were considered and often called immigrants. And therefore we were subject, I guess, at that time to much, let's say, racism, and also to many descriptions from the people around us. And these descriptions were concerned with race. They were concerned with whether we really belonged in Britain, whether we could fit in, whether we felt that we were Indian or whether we were English, if we were mongrel children, or what the hell were we? And of course you must remember at this time that miscegenation was considered to be abhorrent, even then. And it was very unusual for there to be mixed race marriages. So I found myself flung into this situation which was not of my making, and then a situation which I then had to try and understand. And this was not only to do with my, let's say, my psychological health, but to do with understanding the relation between Britain and the Empire. And what happened after the end of the Empire, and the recruiting of immigrants from India and Pakistan and what later became Bangladesh, and of course the Caribbean, to Britain. And the beginning of what became later known as a multicultural society. So I found myself, through no fault of my own, as it were, in this odd situation. And it was a situation which nobody really had written about before, or perhaps nobody had really been in. And I was very enthusiastic about literature. And the books I read by British authors, let's say Ian Forster or Graham Greene or Evelyn Waugh or whoever, were all written by white people. And they often were about the empire, but of course they were written from the point of view of the let's say, the dominator. So all this I had as a teenager and as a young man to try and work out, to try and think about, to try and understand, in order to see why I was going mad and who I was. So when I began to write, it was really an exploration of how it was that my parents came to be married, and how my father, a Muslim from Madras, came to be in this suburb. But I realized that this was not only to do with my personal life, it was to do with a historical situation that I also had to write about. So I began to write, really when I was a teenager, I began to write in order, I can see now looking back, this is the story I told myself. I began to write to try and figure out how it was that I was where I was. And this, I was mostly concerned with my father because he was interested in writing, and he introduced me to literature. We had a lot of books in our house, and I thought that writing would stop me being crazy. When I say crazy, I mean somebody who couldn't understand what was happening to them, couldn't see much of the world into which they had been born. It was also the 1960s, and there was, mostly in London, but not only in London, a big explosion of art from people who were mostly lower middle class, like the Beatles and so on. So all these things coincided to try and, I guess, to stimulate me to try and become a writer. So that's how it sort of came about.
Would you say that your privileged object of writing is your own life? Do you always write about yourself? Are you always in what you write?
I'm somewhere in there, but it's not only me. In a sense, I don't know. I mean, you write from your, in the end, you write from your unconscious. And in my unconscious, it's not only me, it's also the world that lives and speaks through me. So what you try and do when you write is try and put yourself, you might say, to one side. You could say you write from your own experience, but it's not only your own experience that is, as it were, you.
Having been brought up in this ambivalent situation of domination, how does it feel to have become commander of the British Empire in 2008?
It seems amazing to me now, I'm 60, looking back, that I became an artist at all. It seems amazing to me that I made a living for my whole life as a writer, which is now, looking back, a very, very difficult thing to do. And I've written I consider myself, but indeed my girlfriend also considers me to be a very lazy person. Actually, when I look at the number of books, films, etc., stories I've written, again, it seems amazing to me. And not only that, that I brought up my 3 children as a writer, as an artist. It seemed to me that I never thought I couldn't be a writer. But looking back now, it seems that there really weren't any writers like me. I mean, from an immigrant background, who was somebody like me who was basically semi-delinquent, almost uneducated, and a brown person. The beginning of what became known as multiculturalism. Now, of course, there are many mixed-race writers from all sorts of backgrounds. But in those days, there were very few, and the models were upper-class, mostly upper-class white Englishmen and some upper-class white English women like Virginia Woolf who became writers. So looking back, it seems stranger and odder and more difficult than it did at the time. At the time, all I thought was I'd like to be a writer and that's all I'm good for and that's all I can do, which is probably something that most writers would say about themselves.
Most writers have a city of choice. For you, it's obviously London, isn't it? But you seem a little bit unforgiving when you describe the suburbs. You write in Goodbye Mama, in the book of Suburbia. It's the way you describe this environment.
Well, we couldn't wait to get away. I couldn't wait to get away from the suburbs. And we lived about an hour away, and I could see the river here, and there was the river, the Thames. And when you got on the train and you went across the river into London, you stood up and you cheered with delight. Because in those days, London was very exciting in terms of pop music, in terms of fashion, in terms of photography, in terms of theatre. And so that's where the action was. And the suburbs, for me, were really dull. And of course, that's where your parents were. And one of the things, as you will know, young people want to do is get away from their parents in order to live in the bigger world and to meet and work with other people. And in the suburbs, I've never met anybody who'd spent their whole life working in what we now call the culture industry. You know, the idea that you could become a professional writer or an actor or a theatre director or a movie director, it was impossible in the suburbs. We were trained in the suburbs to be clerks, to work in the civil service. And my father worked in the civil service, in the Pakistani civil service. That was the limit of what we were expected to be and to do. But I wanted to be like the Beatles. I wanted to work in music, in pop, and make a lot of noise, colour, which pop was. So that's why we had to get away in order to. But also London was racially mixed. The suburbs in those days were not racially mixed. People stared at us. It seems unbelievable now. They couldn't believe that there were people who were brown who were living next door to them. It really offended them. And so coming to London, where there were other people of colour, was of great importance to me and felt like a big liberation.
You have given recently an interview to The Guardian where you argued that the British middle class is now more racist than ever. Do you think there's a role played by popular culture in changes in pop culture? In films, actually, this is one of the questions for Final. PhDs in Christina, that has somehow triggered this development into racism?
Well, the new racism in Europe, which we see, particularly I think also in France, with the rise until recently of the National Front, was organised mostly around the figure of the Muslim, and this was a new form of racism that I noticed, and of course in the UK, in Poland and Hungary, with the rise of fascist movements and so on. And this was a new thing. Most of the racism had been directed against people of colour and so on, but the figure of the Muslim, this sort of backward, medieval, sexist, homophobic figure, had become sort of spectre that was haunting Europe in the last few years. And this is what I mean by the new racism. As though we all knew what the Muslim was, what he or she believed. The Muslim had become a description of hate. And I remember as a child being subject to the descriptions of other people. So I began to see how dangerous this new form of racism, organised around the figure of the Muslim, could become. It was a stereotype, a cliche, but it was a way of organising also a political movement, populist right-wing political movement. So I became very interested in this, and I could see that also the middle class had begun to worry about the Muslim invader who was coming to their country to take their jobs, to take their wives, to steal their money, and all the rest. Tropes, of course, that we recognise from the 1930s. So this concerned me very much, and I could see that this stereotype could be very dangerous. For those of us who work in culture, one of the things that is important that we do is that we think about stereotypes and that we start to see how they are made and also to work to dissolve them. Because mostly in the culture business we work with the individual. And we see how the individual is subject to stereotyping and so on. So one of the uses, you might say, of culture, now I prefer to think of culture as being useless, but one of the uses of culture would be to do with dissolving these dangerous ideas.
One of your characters in Nothing writes or says that imagination is dangerous. It's the most dangerous place on earth, right? That's what although
it should be dangerous. If you're lucky, it's dangerous, the imagination, because the imagination, you might say, frees us. We're lucky from habit, from the dead hand or the deadness of habit, that we could think that we could live in another way, that we could have different forms of relationships, that we could speak differently, that we could love differently, that we could behave differently, and this could be an exciting idea that would make the world seem novel and fresh again, if we're lucky. One of the things we like to do is to think of our world as being natural, that this is who we are, this is how we live, this is what a man is, this is what a woman is, this is what a Muslim is, this is what a white person is. We think of these as facts, as natural parts of the world. When we begin to see that they are culturally made, that these are ideas, we can also begin to imagine that they could be something else. And that's quite an exciting thought, because then we can begin to live and think differently, and that will, you might say, cheer us up.
Have you ever felt threatened as an author for things you've written?
Only by my wife. But otherwise, no, why would I?
Well, I think of firstly.
Well, Salman, with the Satanic Verses, he really understands Islam. And he studied Islam at university. He really knows it. So he really knew, as it were. I don't know it in that way at all. I come from half of my family is a Muslim family, but I don't really understand it in that way. and Salman really engaged with Islamic theology in a way that I could never do. So I don't have the intelligence to be blasphemous.
Well, but you can be blasphemous.
I'll do my best. But with me, it's rather a blunt instrument. Salman really knew what he was doing, and he wrote a very beautiful book about theology and turning it around.
Blasphemy does not only deal with religion and blasphemous in other ways. The idea comes from religion. Politics can also be a blasphemy in certain contexts. This is a dangerous word. We were talking earlier about the spectrum of the Muslim. It's difficult to deal with perceived threats and not real threats. And when perceived threats become actually for societies a reality that is stronger than any real threat. So you have to fight with the imagination, right?
Yes, what we're talking about here really are ideas. And ideas that can become very deadening. And so if we are interested in the imagination, we might think of something that would break up that deadness, and we could find a new way of speaking, a new way of relating to other people, a new way of living. This wouldn't be some radical, magical transformation, but of course something that might or might not happen in one's daily life. This is, I guess, why I'm interested and became very interested in psychoanalysis. Because psychoanalysis, the idea of psychoanalysis is the idea of making clear to oneself that which is become habit, or something that has become rather machine-like. So in an analysis you might speak it out loud for the first time, and then you begin to see that you've been living, as it were, without thought. So the idea of Freud was to make something that is unconscious conscious, so that you become aware of it, that you would come to know it, and then you could think about it and see that it was a choice, and that you were a person rather than a machine, dictated to by your unconscious, that you would then, it would be possible for you to live or think differently. So I would say, I like to think that Freud was a great sponsor.
In this light, in this Freudian light, what compels you to write? Is it compensation? Is it
Why do I like to write?
Yes.
I don't really like to write actually anymore. I'm rather bored with it. I really like to watch television. Occasionally I'm excited by it, and I go back to it, and I have ideas, and then suddenly I really want this word. Isabel gave me a notebook earlier, and I was very thrilled to receive this notebook. And I thought, now I've got this notebook, I could write something down if I have a good idea. And occasionally I really want to write something down, and I become inspired again.
So television.
I like to write. Well, the only reason to write, and the only reason, in fact, to do anything at all in the world is because you're excited by it, that it turns you on in some way. That going to your desk and writing stuff down seems a really good idea at the time. That's why I used to do it. But I also did it for money. I mean, writing for me was a mixture of art and commerce. I had 3 kids. I had to make a living and make these children go to school occasionally and pay for it and all of that. So it was a necessity which was very important. Now I'm writing a TV show with one of my kids, my first boy, Sashin, who's 23. And so my pleasure really now is to teach him, insofar as I can, teach him how to write, but also to form a new relationship with my children as an adult. Because in the 60s, when we left home and we never really went back, and our relationships with our families really obviously continued, but that sort of intimacy really ended. So when I write with my son Sashin, and we sit down for hours together and talk and argue, and he hates me and I hate him at times, this is a new form of relationship that I can make with the kids, and which I find very interesting. and I can see him learning, and I am modified by him, and his view of the world as a kid of 23, 24, is really interesting to me, and I couldn't write from his point of view. So he and I can do something together, and he can stimulate me, and I can get interested in writing again and renew myself through him and through other people. And I guess I've always worked with other people. I've worked with Steve McCreas, my pal. I've worked with Roger, I've worked with David Bowie, I've worked with Akram Khan. I'm always interested in collaborating with other artists. Because again, that's the way in which you can renew yourself as a writer, because it's very easy as a writer, you get stuck in a room, you know? You get stuck in a room with the door closed, you're scribbling away for hours, and it's boring as hell.
Film and television are always collective efforts, so
Yeah.
it's not only about you write, but you engage with other artists. What drives to say that television is now much more exciting than writing? Does it fulfill the role that the novel had in the 19th century?
Everybody talks about TV. I saw Isabel last night, and I said to my girlfriend, we've come all the way from England to Portugal in order to discuss Series 6 of The Good Wife. And of course, if you go to anybody's house, everybody's watching, it's globalized, everybody's watching the same shows. Everybody's talking about The Leftovers, or Breaking Bad, or Atlanta, or whatever the latest shows are. And there's something wonderful about that, because television has become something that everybody talks about. And when I worked as a kid and I worked in the theatre, one of the things we talked about all the time was, how do we get this stuff to the big audiences? Well, the big audiences, the National Theatre really is on TV. So I'm very interested in television. I like being a lazy person watching television. But also, television is really alive at the moment in many ways, particularly American television, despite the dead hand of Donald Trump. It certainly seems to have stimulated many artists to work in new ways. And there are shows on TV like Transparent that are really, really far out and very interesting and made by very interesting young artists. So that's why.
And what about the role of politics in television? And going back to the question that Christina, whether television and film were also to blame vis-a-vis certain, talking about racism, but what is taking place in society. So what about the politics of the artwork?
Well, if you look at a show like Transparent, I don't know how many of you have seen it, it's on Amazon. It's a show about a Jewish family in Los Angeles, and the father becomes a woman. And the show is very progressive and complex and interesting about gender politics, for instance. And there are incredible sexual scenes, particularly later on in the show with Angelica Houston, for instance, who shows her body, or a woman who's had breast cancer, who has sex with a man who's become a woman who's wearing a cardigan. Some of these scenes are extraordinary, and you think this is much further out in terms of its exploration of gender than anything you can see in the movies. And TV is great for writers because, as you say, it's like the 19th century novel, because you have such space. With a movie, the length of the movie became very restrictive, and we know why movies were 90 minutes or 2 hours long and so on. But you've watched 7 series of Good Wife. I mean, seasons. This is an incredible endurance that you've gone through, Isabel, and I would say that this is a great opportunity for us as artists to write really widely and really deeply and explore a society from the most individual person to politics, through family, through children, through work, and to really see what the hell's going on in the world. So I'm very keen on this new development in culture, and it's really at the centre. And to me, has really taken over as the most interesting place for artists to express themselves. As a kid, the most interesting thing was always pop music. I grew up when you heard the Beatles records for the first time. We ran to the radio to hear these records, you know, and it was really alive and new, and this was the forefront of the most exciting culture. It was like being alive in the Renaissance. And then pop died, but luckily there are other forms in which artists are working now. And I think at the moment it's TV. It's not only TV, but it's a great opportunity, particularly for young people to write it and to make movies at great length, because there is so much television, and therefore there are, if you're lucky, opportunities.
One last question before we move into taking questions from the audience. And a question pertaining to the Buddha of suburbia. You speak in the book as well about cataracts on the road. Do you ever have the fear that some of your early writing is writing that is in the street for young readers and younger readers, and that as they grow up in age, that they look differently upon this early writing? How do you look at the novels, at your first novels?
Listen, it's amazing to me that they're in print at all. You know, when you write a book, you sit in your room alone, you write this book, and you think, will this book ever be published? Secondly, will it ever be reviewed? Thirdly, will it be reviewed well? Fourthly, will anyone ever read it? Fifthly, will it be translated? And so on. So if you look back, I published the Buddha, I think in 1990, 1991. I can't even count how long ago that was. It seems, so you're lucky, you should be lucky, count yourself lucky if anybody ever reads one of your books after 20 years, 30 years, or whatever it is. That it's still in print and still around, and here we are in a room in Portugal talking about a book I didn't even think at the time that I would ever finish, would ever be published, or anyone would ever read. So I think you should, as we say, count your blessings if anybody is interested in your work at all, if it remains relevant. But I have to remember at the same time I was at a party the other day, and a young Asian kid who's become a poet, he came up to me and he said, when I read your novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, and I read the first line of the book, which is, my name is Karim Amir and I'm an Englishman born and bred almost, he said to me, I realized that was the book for me. And he said that somebody was speaking to me and for me. And he said to me, at that moment I thought, well, maybe somebody like me could become a writer. And now he's become a poet. So I thought, when he said that, at that moment I thought my life hasn't been entirely wasted. You know, I've done something that is some use to somebody else. And this book that I read so many years ago is of some value, so it hasn't been entirely a stupid waste of time. So, and I still remember reading on the road. And so in a sense it's that relation between the work and the reader, and the fact that the reader is influenced, that is changed, inspired or stimulated by the book, that makes the whole thing worthwhile.
Is it astonishing to speak for others? That so many people feel that in your voice you feel mirrored in your voice?
Well, I wrote for myself, I wrote about myself, but I wrote out of desperation. I wrote because I was a boy in a room in the suburbs thinking, what the hell am I doing here? What's the point of my life, and why do I feel so bad? So I wrote this book, and I sent this book out into the world, a message in a bottle. But it reached somebody, and here we are now, and it wasn't pointless, so that is very moving to me, yeah.
Well,
and that's quite a good reason for anybody here to think about being a writer. You know, when you're young and you begin to write, you sit there and you think, no one's going to be interested in this, why would anyone want to read my book, it means nothing, blah blah blah, all the usual superego self-hate that one is subject to. I can only say, well, all you can do is write your book, write it down, say it, speak it, pass it on to somebody else, and then that somebody else will, if you're lucky, make you realize that your words are not stupid or worthless. They're important. It's the other person, it's the reader that makes the book matter.
Without the intervention of creative writing classes?
Well, I have creative writing classes from my father. I teach creative writing. I'm not a big fan of it. I'm trying not to be sacked at the moment, so don't provoke me, Isabel. I'm a professor at the university. I'm trying to remain a professor at the university, despite your efforts to plumb off the faculty.
Okay, now we move on to questions from the floor. Who'd like to start? Yes, Leanna.
So, thank you for coming, and I will ask for an autograph.
It would be a pleasure.
Book. And in fact, I have a set of questions, but of course I'm not going to monopolize you. And there is one that particularly interests me that has to do with this. Do you think that Brexit can be understood as a kind of response, and in a provocative way, a kind of
There's a microphone there.
a kind of translation to the loss of empire?
Yes, I think so. That's a very interesting thing to say. The empire, the loss of the empire, the blow, you might say, to British narcissism went very deep. Went very deep. And there are many people in the UK who felt really excluded from globalization and from the new super-capitalism that developed in the West since Reagan and Thatcher. And those people are washing around in parts of Britain where there are few jobs, there's less industry, education is in decline, there's nothing much for them to do, they have very little hope. So suddenly they thought if they voted for Brexit, that they would get rid of all these immigrants and that they would all have jobs and everything would be better. I have to say that there's a lot of illusory thinking in all of that, but at least they had the hope that if we got rid of the European Union, that their lives would suddenly improve. And I think many of us felt that those people had been really destroyed by Thatcherism, who had closed down all those industries, which had then moved, as you know, to the third world, etc. And that we didn't have a politics that really spoke for those people, so that you could see that they would turn to the right or even to the extreme right, and that they would want a vision of England that was, as you say, nostalgic, was in the past, an England that was strong, independent, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. But now it's a year since Brexit, and now everybody's getting, as we say, cold feet, and they're getting really nervous about this radical Brexit. And it seems to me that we're not really going to have that kind of Brexit at all now, actually, and people are very nervous about whether they're going to lose jobs, the prices are going to go up, etc., so that their lives are not going to be improved. So I think people thought that if we had a Brexit, it would be like magic. You know, it would be a magical transformation, that suddenly there would be no more immigrants, etc., taking their jobs, there would be more work, and etc., etc. But there's not much truth in all of that now, and I think people are being suddenly much more realistic. And the sort of radical Brexit that they thought they were going to get is luckily not going to happen at all. And there will be all kinds of, as we say in English, fudges that we thought at the time would probably occur. So, a gentleman over there. So don't try, you Portuguese, don't try this Brexit stuff yourself. I wouldn't recommend it.
Hello, thank you. My name is Helios. I have a question about sex. You're quoted as saying somewhere that our sexual love of one another seems to have become a political act. And you say, remember that every time you're fucking, you're defying political Islam, right? Or something. Right? This is not my quote. I don't know if you actually said this.
I hope so. I don't remember. It was probably, maybe it was one of my characters, or maybe it was me.
Right. So my question is basically about another aspect of sex, and that is the relationship to the body. So not so much of sex as basically an instrument to defy Islam, or as a symptom of a time, but rather as connected to, let's say, contagion, the body in a negative sense also, right? Decay, death in the end. So I was wondering how basically the bodily aspects of sex work in your work.
Well, I really grew up in the 1950s, when sex was really prohibited, at least in the suburbs anyway. And you really couldn't see anybody's body. You never saw anybody's body. The idea of seeing a woman naked, or indeed a man or anyone naked, was, can you imagine, it was so shocking. We never saw anybody naked. We didn't know what women looked like at all under their clothes. We even used to look at paintings in order to, can you imagine, we went to art in order to see people with no clothes on. So I come from, so my fascination with sexuality, my fascination with the body and all of that really came out of prohibition, that you couldn't see, nobody talked about it. And then of course in the 1960s and through to the 1980s there was this revelation of sexuality, of conversation about sexuality, of course the very important development of feminism, and then later on all this talk about people's bodies, the size, the shape, the kind, black, white, all of that. So it was a revelation to me, and I've written as much as I can about all of that. And then really neoliberalism and the machine-likeness of sex. Because in the 60s we thought that sex would really free people, that it would really liberate people, that we would get away from what Freud called repression. And if we didn't have repression, that we would become happier. And indeed we did become happier. And then one of the things that I noticed about neoliberalism was that people became very uptight about their bodies, and everybody started going to the gym, and everybody had to look a certain way, and everybody had to be fit, and everybody could retool and rebuild their bodies. And indeed I wrote a book which is over there called The Body, about this new idea of the body, that we could have any body that we wanted. But it also became once again a very conformist idea that only certain bodies people wanted. And he buys in my book the body of I think of an Italian footballer, a Juve player, I hope. So I got very interested in this, and then I got very interested in the so-called neoliberal idea that everybody should have sex all the time, and they should have very good sex all the time with very beautiful people. And they started using Tinder and Grindr and all of that stuff. And I was quite shocked by how machine-like the whole thing became like the Marquis de Sade. The people were doing wilder and dirtier and more awful things, but there was no real contact between them. So that this idea that we had, Freudian idea that we had of getting rid of repression, far from liberating enough, that it became a kind of endless sexual torment. And this made me laugh, and I began to write about it, and many other people have written about it too. And so the question really is, which is the question between a reader really and a writer, which is that how do you make contact with other people through your body? How do you make other contact with real contact with other people through conversation or through culture? And so this question, which is the Freudian question, still remains, and it's a very interesting question, particularly for those of us who work in the so-called culture, to think about what it is to really to be intimate, to be close, to know other people, to be able to speak to them and to make love with them in ways that are let's say, really imaginative, and that are not in another way devaluing sexuality or conversation or contact between people.
A lady there.
Good morning, my name is Christina. I would like you to keep your job at the university, but let's imagine I read something where the author said creative writing and such courses are a waste of time. the whole system is set up to silence writers and dupe students. It doesn't even provide a safe haven for writers, as the author made clear, because most universities go out of their way to ruin writers with admin, overwork, and other nonsense. So, what would you recommend a young writer? Because creative writing courses are not what you recommend. So, and I would like to know what do you recommend for a young writer to pursue or to improve their skills? And in what way has the university influenced you in your work, being good or bad? Thank you.
I've never said that it's impossible to learn, and contact between an artist, an older writer, and young writers are really important. And when I was a young writer and I worked in the theatre at the Royal Court, I learned a lot. I learned a lot from sitting in the pub with other writers. What I said was that the idea of doing an MA or a PhD in writing a novel, turning it into an academic exercise, is often idiotic. And my students are often more concerned about getting an MA or a PhD than they are in being artists. And that really disturbs me. I said to one writer the other day, "Why are you doing this?" She said, "I want to get a PhD." I said, "Well, you know, you write a book because it's a gift to another person. It's a form of pleasure. It's a form of exchange. You don't write a book because you're going to get a PhD." I said, "Why do you want a PhD?" She said, "Because I want to get a job." I said, "A job as what?" She said, "As a creative writing teacher." So the whole thing is going round and round, and it seemed to me to be rather dead. You know, it's like teaching, you know, pop music which started out as being so authentic and so wild and so outside of, let's say, so-called capitalism. Then you go into a university classroom and start teaching, you know, the University of Lou Reed studies, for instance. And it seems to me to be to deaden something. But I'm very happy to talk to any young person who comes to see me about writing and to teach them and to give them my advice and my views for what they are worth. And I would always encourage people to write and to express themselves. But the idea that you could do this in a course and that you could do it over a year seems to me to be a very narrow view, or that having an MA or a PhD makes you into a writer is an idiotic idea. That doesn't make you an artist. What makes you an artist is that somebody else wants to read your books and that they have meaning for them and that there's a real love and a moment of exchange between the artist and the reader. So trying to academize something. Well, working in academia is really useful for writers like me because we earn money. You know, it's not so useful for the students, but it's very good for the teachers because we get jobs. And then we can spend the rest of our time, you know, arsing about and writing. But I think that sometimes, and some of the writers are really bad, you know, and the teachers are lied to them about their work and what they can become and what they can do. And I find that to be very dishonest, actually. But the idea of teaching and working with young people and speaking to them about writing is really important, really a big deal. And I was taught a lot by many people when I was a young writer. I never did a course because I'm too, let's say, rebellious to do a course. I would go crazy sitting there with some teacher telling me how to write. But I've been taught very well by people. So my views are not quite so crude as they can sometimes sound.
Thank you. My name is Gregor. What about the role of the editor? There are some writers who don't let editors nowhere near the texts. For example, thinking about your novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, it seems to me that it has been written very quickly and wonders through. But how does it go for you?
Well, on the Buddha of Suburbia, I had 3 editors on that book. One of them was my girlfriend at the time, the mother of 2 of my children, Tracy. She worked on the book a lot. And if you see the manuscript in the British Library, you can see her notes on it. I also worked with my editor at Faber, Robert McCrum. He worked on it. No, he's more lazy. And I also worked on it with Nan Graham, who I saw the other day, my American editor. So I had a lot of help and many notes and many conversations with people. it's not so much the editing, it's not the notes they make on the text, really, that's so important, though it is important. What's really important are the conversations you have about the book. If you sit down with an editor and have a long conversation about a book, that conversation may help you to see the book differently, and may help you focus your ideas about what actually that book is. And those conversations with an editor are more important than them saying, why don't we change that word or move that bit over here, etc., which I think is also important, not stupid. But the conversations you might have with somebody, it's like going into into therapy. The fact of speaking, the fact of saying something at all, of making it known, let's say, to yourself, or hearing yourself say something, is really important and really generative when it comes to the imagination. So if I sit down with a student, if I'm teaching a student, I might say to the student, don't show me your book, or the chapters, or the opening of your novel, but sit down and tell me the story, okay? And they might sit down and they will tell me the story, well, this happens and that happens and that happens. And then when I read the book, when they've told me the story is usually clearer and much better than the book. And I realise that they haven't actually, as it were, grasped what the story is. So you might say that working with an editor and speaking through an idea with somebody else can be really useful, and in that sense a teacher would be very useful, or an editor, or a friend, or whatever. You just need somebody who knows how to talk about writing, actually. That's and there aren't many people who really are good at that and know how to do that, and really talk to you about a book in order to help you to see that you can make it better.
I would like to know, how is your relationship to translation? I imagine your work as translated work, and do you have any relationship also with the translators of your work? Do you work maybe together sometimes?
Well, I just had a book, I read a book called The Nothing recently, and the first translation was translated into Italian by a man I know a little bit, Davide, and he texted me a bit, some questions, and he made suggestions about stuff that was difficult for him to translate, and we discussed it and went through it and so on. But I don't speak Italian, and in the end I have to trust him. He's an artist too. He knows how to write, he has an imagination, and he understands the language. So we as writers, we are really grateful to our translators who make our work known to other people. But God knows what they're saying. They could write anything. I mean, they could make it worse, or they could improve it, or neither, or something else altogether. God knows what they're doing with it. But without their translators, we wouldn't have readers. And I wouldn't have read, I don't know, Flaubert, or Dostoevsky, or Gogol, or Tolstoy, or Japanese writers, or Chinese writers, or whatever, except through the mud or the clear glass of the translation. But these people are really essential to us as writers, because we can't write in 30 languages. But as I say, God knows what it looks like or what it's saying. And I've heard some terrible stories of people coming up to me and saying, your book in this language bore no relation whatsoever to what you wrote. The guy obviously just sat in a room and wrote down whatever he liked. But it's very difficult. We can't, as writers, you can do your best and you can have conversations with the translator. But you can't really, some of them, they never speak to you and they never ask for notes or whatever, so you have no idea what they're doing.
Hello, morning. My name is Matt. We noticed that the book, The Border of Suburbia, which was published, you say, around 1990, 91, so it's towards the end of the Great Thatcher era, and around the time of the poll tax riots, it seems to me. I think you made pretty clear your certain disdain for neoliberalism, but I wondered if you could comment on the idea of the political context and to what extent that influenced that work specifically and your work more broadly.
Well, the Buddha is set in the 70s, but it's set in the suburbs, so it's really in a way about the 60s. We didn't really have the 60s until the 70s in the suburbs. Everything's a bit slower in the suburbs. It takes ages to catch up. So yeah, the book at the beginning, certainly the beginning of the book, has a very 60s atmosphere to it. That was the 70s really in the suburbs. The second half of the book is really about, is more set in the 70s, about politics of the 70s, about political groups that I was aware of, that my friends were in, Trotskyite groups like the WRP and the SWP, that I found very amusing and I'm quite satirical about at the time, but I'm a very cynical person about politics, I guess. And then by the end of the Buddha Suburbia, she's become, what's her name? Eva. His father's lover becomes a decorator and a sort of entrepreneur. And you can see the new Thatcherism entering the world at the end of the book. Just as in My Beautiful Laundrette, Daniel Day-Lewis and Gordon Warnock, the two boys at the beginning, gay boys in the movie, become Thatcherite entrepreneurs. So you can see the politics, I can see looking back now, the politics of the day entering these stories. And as a writer, I'm really interested in the political, the social world, but interested in the individual too, in the way and the way in which the individual is made by the social world. Just as somebody like me who comes from, let's say, a Muslim immigrant background, was seen and defined by, and described by other people. And it's this interaction for me as a writer, the personal, this individual, this man, this woman, and how they move around in the political world. That intersection is where I want to write. So whether it's Thatcherism, whether it's socialism, whether it's neoliberalism, whether it's fascism, whatever is going on at the time, it's how you live as an individual in that particular world that interests me, I guess, whatever it is.
Thank you very much for everything you talked. I have a question about your relation to your son, whom you are working for the television. Could you imagine to let you guide through your son also to work here for the new media, so-called new media, like YouTube or something like that, or do you touch on TV?
Well, we work in TV because you can't really make money out of YouTube.
Okay.
I'm trying to help this boy make a living so I don't have to support him for the rest of his life. And he's a drain on my financial resources. My kids, they went to university, and then when they came back, they couldn't get jobs. And the jobs they got were really humiliating. They worked in bars, they worked in restaurants, they worked doing this and that. And they found it very humiliating, very badly paid, and they felt that they were wasting their time and their brains. So I thought, well, these boys are really desperate, you know, these are desperate, they're so desperate they may have to become writers. And so I encouraged them to write, and I trained them and teach them to write, and they really are the future of writing, these kids and kids like that. And they spend their whole life watching television. So I thought, fuck it, all those years watching television wasn't such a waste of time after all. And they know a lot about TV actually, and they can talk about it very well now. So finally, as Lacan says, your symptom is your opportunity, you might say. And I think if they are lucky, they will become creative, which is important to me, and I believe in that as an interesting way of life, but also have the ability to make a living, to give them some self-respect.
Morning. It's a question.
wonderful to be here and listen to you. Do you feel as a writer?
You'll have to speak up. I'm really deaf. I can.
Do you feel you're a writer of double belonging? Do you feel you have double belonging? And if so, do you think there's an essence in you that is untranslatable? What do you think about untranslatability? Essences.
Do I have a double belonging? Well, I think I used to have a double belonging, as you put it, and it's a beautiful way of putting it. But now, in London, everybody has a double belonging. You know? And London is such a far-out, multi-racial, multicultural experiment. Nobody in London belongs. You know, my girlfriend is Italian. We walk around my neighborhood together, and she says, everybody here is speaking Italian, or they're speaking French. And you suddenly realize that all of Europe is suddenly congregated in our neighborhood. That everybody has a double belonging, as you put it, but also they also feel that they belong to this city, London. And this is quite a new thing, really, in Britain, because you were in Britain when I was a kid, you were English. And there were very few people who were elsewhere, really. And suddenly London has become this new experiment where nobody is from London, and everybody's passing through and part of London. And everybody has their own community, whether it's the Somalian community, the Pakistani community, the Portuguese community, the Italian community, the French community. People gather in their communities, but there is also a great sense among people, whether you're Italian, French, Portuguese, whatever, that you're also a Londoner. That you're making the city, you're a part of the city, you identify with the city. And I noticed that particularly since Brexit, and also recently, I know you had a fire here in Portugal, we had a fire in London too, and you felt among Londoners a great sense of solidarity. The people really were Londoners too, and that they were actually making the city and remaking it, and that they were not aliens from elsewhere, but they were in fact to become, as it were, Londoners. And that was a very beautiful thing to notice, and it was quite recent actually, after the horror of Brexit and after, as I said, this fire and so on. There's a real solidarity among people in London now, that everybody is from, in a sense, from elsewhere, but also we have another identity, which is to be a Londoner, and that's quite a beautiful and a very optimistic making thing for me.
Thank you very much for being here. My name is Vera, and I have a question regarding also the book of Suburbia. You said you were surprised that it still sells and people are still reading it. I am a late arrival. I read it after 2008, 2010 even, I think. And it was an enormous pleasure at a time that was pessimistic to read this outrageously funny and polite, but at the same time very serious, socially and politically engaged novel. And my question is whether you think that, and I felt that we were in need of books like that, whether you think that it is possible to in some way translate that spirit, the 90s mixed with the 70s, or the 60s if you will, into today, and it is working with your son for the medium of television. If that could be a way to do that.
Well, I wrote that book, The Buddha, with real exuberance, you know, and I wrote it as I write everything, out of real pleasure and happiness and a desire to make other people laugh and to communicate with other people. But what I'm mostly interested in now is, because I have 3 kids who are of a young age, in their late teens, early 20s, I'm really interested in young people, you know, and what the world is like for them, what their employment prospects are, how they love other people, what they hope for the future, and how they're going to make young people like you make and remake the world, and how they can get involved in politics, and I hope at a young age also become politicians, and get involved in feminism and anti-racist movements and so on. And we've seen a great achievement among in the UK, among Jeremy Corbyn, of enthusiasm for young people in politics. and activism and so on. And I hope that young people, as indeed they are, making music, making movies, writing books, getting involved in the world, because it's very easy for young people, particularly in some European countries, to feel really disillusioned with the political process, to feel that there's no place for them. I know certainly young people in Italy really feel there's no place for them there, that they can't get work, they can't get involved in politics, that they will never change anything, etc. The truth is that that is not true, and we've certainly seen in the UK around Jeremy Corbyn, who recently made a big speech at Glastonbury. We've seen a huge enthusiasm among young people for activism and so on, and they're using mostly social media. They're not using the conventional newspapers to speak and communicate with one another, and that makes me really cheerful. Actually, insofar as I'm ever cheerful, that makes me really cheerful that the kids are rebelling, are speaking, are being creative. And so I am quite optimistic, actually, shockingly enough, about the future of Europe.
Thank you very much for being here and for this interesting dialogue. I would like to go back to your interest on television, because you did say that today it gives the writer this larger audience, and how it has this importance of having an impact on people's life and so on. And I was thinking, because when you were talking about Transparent, The Good Wife, all those progressive serials that many of us have watched, and I mean, they are seen all over the world. But at the same time, we have a rise of nationalism, we have a rise of xenophobia. So my question would be, I mean, for me this seems like a kind of a paradox, like as if the writers that manage to have an impact worldwide, and somehow, because people find them entertaining, people follow these serials, but then at the same time, it doesn't seem to really stop that people think the other way in terms of politics, in terms of nationalism.
No, that's never going to happen. The Rolling Stones are never going to make the revolution. They're never going to stop the world. I mean, we believed in the 1960s that pop would make a revolution. And it did make a revolution, actually. It made a revolution in terms of feminism. Pop made a revolution in terms of, let's say, the ability to a certain extent of black and people of colour to have their voices heard. But it's certainly never going to turn the world into a paradise. I think that will be that's too much like magical thinking. But we carry on, and actually, the world that I grew up in the 1950s and through the conservative 1960s in the suburbs has been wildly improved by politics, by pop music, by new ideas, by the culture of the 1960s actually. And it's wildly different and wildly better. It's no paradise, which is probably a mercy because I'm not a keen utopian. But I think we have to carry on thinking and working and making the world better for people through our intervention in it. But the idea that we would transform it into a paradise and we would get rid of Donald Trump by either watching or making great shows like Transparent, I think that's as it were, a step too far. But you know, one of the things we said, one of the things that we hoped for was that after the Brexit vote, let's say, and after the election of Donald Trump, some of us thought or said, and maybe a little optimistically, that there would be a real revival in the left, there would be a real revival in the opposition. And the truth is, really, actually, certainly in the UK, I can't speak for the US so much, in the UK there really has been a great revival of radical ideas and opposition actually around this rather strange politician called Jeremy Corbyn. So strangely, the right and the rise of the populist right has really stimulated young people to get involved in the world again. And it seems to me that's very positive.
Thank you very much for this. Oh, there's one question. Yeah.
Thank you. You were just talking about Jeremy Corbyn and the sort of post-Brexit transformations in British politics, and on the other hand talking also about the City of London and what it has become in recent decades. One of the great events in the history of London, of course, was the election of the current mayor, Sadiq Khan, and the fact that he comes from a working class Pakistani family was, an enormously important element in how his election was understood and received. But he's of course also a Blairite, a pretty strong Blairite, who has demonstrated in recent months quite clearly that he's willing to do the service that he's required to do in going after Jeremy Corbyn and in the efforts of the Labour, the sort of rump Blairites to try and displace Corbyn. So I'm wondering if you think there is there a wider lesson there about the limits of identity politics? In Britain itself, of course, and multicultural London, but beyond that as well. Any thoughts you have?
Yes, I think what you say is very interesting. And Sadiq Khan, who's apparently his favourite book is The Buddha of Suburbia, so I'm become a very big fan of Sadiq Khan, despite the fact that he, as you say, is possibly a Blairite. It's very interesting that we have a Muslim mayor of London. And it was obviously important to him, as you suggest, that he distanced himself from Jeremy Corbyn because he's his own man. But the challenges of London are really not to do with encouraging, let's say, wild speculation and capitalism, but the challenges of London that we've noticed, certainly in the last few weeks since the fire, is really about public health, public safety, and public housing. And so it seems to me that though, as you say, he may or may not be a Blairite, it seems to me that he's fully aware that the needs of London are not with more extreme capitalist speculation, but actually we need a very good housing for many people. Otherwise we're going to turn London into a paradise for the super rich and a hell for everybody else. And I can see it in my own neighbourhood that the houses are mostly owned by super rich people who either live and work in London or are from elsewhere, and then with the immigrant workers and labourers who serve them. And I think Sadiq Khan is too clever a politician, has too much understanding of London to realise that let's say the creative health of London lies in its diversity and its multiplicity, and that supercapitalism is driving that out of the city. So he may be, as you put it, a Blairite, but I don't think he's so stupid not to understand that London is a unique and beautiful city, and remains so only because of all the different classes and types of people who live there. And if you destroy that by moving out to mostly middle income, lower income, and poor working class people, the city will become basically a gated community for wealthy investors from overseas, and that will be a hell. So it'll be. I think your question is very interesting, and I'm very interested to see what Sadiq will do in the future. And I'm not sure that his Blairiteness is necessarily the end of the story when it comes to his understanding and love of London and what's required there. I'll take. Let's do one more question before we stop.
Thank you. Back to the thing you had mentioned about free writing and social media, that the young people are more involved in freely expressing their emotions, whether it's about racism or other political issues. Do you also believe that the social media, this free writing, also has enhanced people's cultural identity, driving them to strong case of extremism sometimes? Do you believe that it has an effect on it?
It's an interesting question because one of the things that happened to me as a teenager, living in the suburbs and as a person of colour and someone from an immigrant background, was that I was completely isolated. That I had no contact with anybody else like me, that I'd never met anybody else like me. and I read some books, mostly American writers like James Baldwin, and of course the genius Ellison, Richard Wright, and so on. And then I found a book written by a writer called E.R. Braithwaite called To Sow with Love. It was about a black teacher in the East End, a black man who is much racially abused. And this was the first book I'd ever found that was set in contemporary London, and there was about the experience of people of colour. So one of the things that made me want to be a writer was the fact that I felt completely isolated, that nobody wrote for me, nobody spoke for me, and there was nobody else like me. And so I'm not a huge fan of social media because I don't think it's deep enough or serious enough. But one of the things that social media does is that it does create contact between people. It does create solidarity between people. That you, sitting in your room, lonely and thinking there's nobody else like me, you can reach other people who are indeed like you, who can speak for you and can articulate your feelings for you, and you can speak with them and develop and exchange ideas together. And that, for me as a writer, was something that I had to go to literature. So I began to read, I don't know, Jack Kerouac or Samuel Beckett or Balzac or Flaubert or Dostoevsky. And I began to feel some affinity with these writers because I felt that there was a time when they must have felt like me. I think the media can really help people to contact one another and not to feel isolated in terms of how they feel about their race, their colour, their body, their gender, their sexuality, or whatever. And I think that's a really big advance, and so I'm a big fan of social media. But I would say that the novel or the poem or the television show or the record album or whatever, these are much deeper forms of exploration than social media allows. So I'm a big fan, although I'm a fan of social media, I'm a bigger fan of what I would call real culture, which is a very deep and a much more serious exploration of this stuff than social media on the whole allows.
Thank you very much for the conversation. We'll continue to converse with you through your books. Thank you very much.